Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. There's still people filtering their way in. And I'm going to be recording the meeting because I've received several emails that people are away on vacation and are hoping to see a recording of it. And I think it's a common time when a lot of people are away on vacation right now. So. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Perhaps I'll get started just in the interests of time. So hopefully you can see my screen here that I'm sharing and everybody can hear me okay. So today we're going to be speaking about our research grants and awards competition. Just as a little bit of an agenda, I'm going to give a bit of a background to myself and to some of the changes that we're interested in making to the programs as we move forward. And then some details in particular of this year's competitions. And then there should be some time at the end, if I don't talk too long, to answer any questions that people may have. So I thought I'd start with just introducing myself. I know many of you, but certainly not everybody out there. So my name's Paul Eckford. I've been at SickKids for a little over 12 years, and I've recently joined CF Canada as the program director for research. So one of my responsibilities will be the grants and awards competition, among other things. And some of those things we'll get into in a little bit. So at SickKids, one of my roles was to manage our CFIT program, which was a large program jointly funded by SickKids Foundation and Cystic Fibrosis Canada. And through that, among my many duties was managing a small grants program and a training program. And I was involved in trying to develop some industry collaborations, managing some large budgets. And so I think good experience for my new role with CF Canada. And everybody so far has been very welcoming from the community. So thank you for that. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about our research areas and the research drift that we've seen. So in the past, of course, as you know, our research topics have really been researcher directed. So we put out a call, people decide a focus of their research plan, and they apply, and we award the grants and awards based on the scientific merit of the applications, but not necessarily a lot of strategy behind what areas of focus there are. And if we look over the past 7 or 8 years or so, we see that this sort of self-directed approach has resulted in some drifts in focus. So for example, if we look at infection research, we've gone from a little over 30 to 46% of our total funded applications, while at the same time, research on inflammation has gone from over 20% down to less than 10%. And this has all sort of been self-directed by the researchers, and we can break it up into different categories that have different trends in them as well. And certainly this is one way to run a research program. But as you'll see in a moment, the organization would like us to try a little bit of a different focus here. So recently, CF Canada has developed a new strategic plan that covers the years 2020 to 2023. And the major focus of impact for this strategic plan is that over the next 10 years, the organization will achieve improved health outcomes and quality of life for all people with cystic fibrosis in Canada. And the work will be done through several principles. Our work is informed by people living with cystic fibrosis, focused on the niche within the global context, knowing that we can't do everything, and we're in an environment where other researchers do exist within the global niche. The work will be dedicated to innovation, and we'd be committed to working in partnership. And so these are important goals that we're taking to heart. And the research plan itself has strategic plan itself has 5 elements. And the most relevant to our research efforts is number 3, to advance research on priority health needs. So working within this global context, as I mentioned, our goal will be to increase the focus on translational and clinical research, having the greatest impact for people with the poorest health prospects, and really a focus on greater potential for near-term impact. And so in light of this new strategic plan, our goal is to develop a research strategy for our research funding efforts. And so this will be a vision document that details how we fund research, and it would align closely with the strategic plan that I mentioned. So the organization has undertaken an effort to determine the research priorities for the CF community. And one of the ways we've done this, you may have noticed a month or 2 ago, there was a survey on our website where we asked members of the community to weigh in on many potential research priorities moving forward. And through that, we got a top 17 list of those priorities. Then a few weeks ago, we held a patient research priorities workshop. And this included participants who were people with cystic fibrosis, also family members or caregivers of individuals with cystic fibrosis, clinicians and other individuals in the circle of care, such as nurses, dietitians, and others, and as well some basic researchers. And there were 27 participants in total at this workshop. They discussed the top 17 research priorities within a large group and also in smaller groups. And through a process of discussion and voting, got that list of priorities down to essentially their top 10 research priorities that the community are most interested for research. So obviously we're not done there. This is just the start of the process. There are many other ways we plan on engaging both the CF community as well as the research community as we work towards developing an overall research strategy. And I anticipate that this strategy is not going to be complete until mid-2022. And even once it is complete, it's going to be sort of a living document that will require frequent updates and revision to it as well. But this will help us to better guide our research investments and our research efforts. So I thought I'd show you what those top 10 priorities were for the community through the workshop. And you'll notice there's actually 11 here, not 10, because the last two, it was a tie for 10th place. So we ended up with 11. And you'll see a variety of things on here, some of which are very focused on the patient experience, which is probably not surprising. The top priority that came through both in the survey as well as during the workshop itself, number one here is to cure CF with gene or stem cell therapies. And it is a very broad topic. But it was very apparent that individuals who will not benefit from Trikafta still are very much in need of some therapy to treat their disease. And the people whose mutations do suggest that they will be amongst the group who will benefit from highly effective modulators still don't view those modulators as a cure for their disease and are still looking for something that would be considered a cure. But at the same time, these individuals through the workshop certainly did express a lot of concern about the individuals who won't benefit from those therapies that they may benefit from, and the need to keep studying these areas, gene and stem cell therapies, so that there is a treatment for all individuals with cystic fibrosis. So you can see some of the other priorities that the individuals had as well. Now I'm going to move on to this slide, and I apologize for the fact that it's a little busy, but it is quite useful in describing where some of our investments are being made and sort of the translational process of getting something very much basic research into something that's in clinical practice. And since, I guess, the 1960s, the organization has been very good at funding very basic research here. And through CF Canada funding, Canadians have made great progress and contributed to where we are today in terms of having some highly effective modulators for at least the majority of individuals with cystic fibrosis. So this area here is really sort of the area where the industry funding is largely focused on clinical trials and transitioning the basic ideas towards clinical practice. And our clinical trials network, CF CanAct, is now operating in this space as well. The organization has put a lot of effort into advocacy in the past few years. In particular, you can think about our advocacy efforts with getting Health Canada approval and ultimately provincial reimbursement for Trikafta, and sort of filling in this valley here between when we determine what clinically will work and getting that into clinical practice. And so that's sort of where the advocacy efforts of CF Canada are working. And certainly the organization has supported very well this area with our healthcare efforts that are led by Ian McIntosh, who I see is on the call here. And then our registry sort of operates in this area as well and informs all of these areas. But what seems to be sort of the most difficult area is what John Wallenberg calls the valley of death here, this first valley, going from a very good basic research idea to getting it into the clinic funded, or into clinical trials at least, funded through industry, and then ultimately on to clinical practice. So many of the great basic research ideas die in this area due to lack of support and perhaps not being quite at the stage for industry to offer support. So one of the things that is clear through our new strategic plan is that we need to help a bit in this area. So you can see I've sort of drawn a little bit of a stretch here and a focus more on sort of this shoulder of the basic research peak here. And the idea would be, of course, we're not abandoning our support of basic research, but there might be a little bit of a shift of a focus to also help really good ideas that need help in transitioning to the next stage and providing some support there over time. And to sort of help make this activation energy to get to the next stage a little bit easier. So that's sort of where the organization is moving. But please don't think that we're abandoning basic research, because that's certainly not the case. So I wanted to provide this as a bit of an overview of generally our research programs overall. So this has been the major area of focus traditionally, and it certainly will be an important area as we go forward. About 80% traditionally of our funding goes to supporting the grants, the basic science grants, the clinical research grants, and the early career investigator awards, which is essentially the grants as well, but in a separate stream for early career individuals so that they don't have to compete directly with more established researchers. So we're certainly going to continue to fund in this area, and it's going to continue to be an important area. Traditionally, about 10% of our funding has gone into this stream in supporting trainees. And for this competition, we're again going to be funding postdoctoral fellowships. I've grayed out these areas here: our graduate studentships, summer studentships, and travel awards. Obviously, in the middle of a pandemic, there isn't much need to fund the travel awards, but I do think that travel for our postdocs and potentially other trainees, once the world goes back to normal, is very important, both to promote CF Canada funded research, but also to get trainees really engaged and eager to continue on in CF research, which I think is important. So I think you'll see this come back in some form in the future. There was an analysis a few years ago that very few of our graduate studentship award holders actually continued on in CF research. And the organization decided to pause this program for a while. And we're not going to be funding it for this year either. But I haven't deleted this because I think that this is still something we need to think about. Just because not a lot of graduate students who were supported by the organization continued in CF research, there may still be a real strong tangible benefit to the labs themselves of having students supported. So, and the same with summer studentships as well. So they're grayed out and they're not being offered for this year, but they may be under consideration to come back in some form in the future. Finally, the remaining 10% of our funding has gone into this area of special initiatives. So that would include targeted research, and sometimes there are calls for targeted research. This year, at the moment, there aren't, although there may be later on. And then many of these out of cycle things as well. Some support for certain core facilities from time to time. Our CF Canada Clinical Trials Network can act. Partnerships with other organizations where we can work together to increase the amount of funding that's available to CF researchers, which we certainly feel is a win for us as well. And then potentially some translational research ideas, things that have good proof of concept in the lab, but aren't quite to the point where industry may invest in them. Through an out-of-cycle process, we'll consider funding some of these with very targeted details. And if you have a research idea that you feel falls into this area, please reach out to me and we can discuss that. further. So this slide describes how our typical research grants competition looks like, certainly in the past competitions. So there would be an open call. The topics are determined by the applicants. The only requirements really are that it's a hypothesis based research project that's related to CF. We would receive the applications, and they would undergo a peer review process where there would be 2 to 3 external peer reviewers each, and these are often typically international CF researchers. Then there would be a panel of scientific peer reviews, and on that panel would be included 2 stakeholders, a caregiver and a person with cystic fibrosis. So the grants would be reviewed. They would be ranked in order. The top numbers would be funded. And this really varies with the amount of budget that is available. And in every competition, there were grants that were considered to be fundable based on quality, but were not funded based on budget constraints. And unfortunately, going forward, I don't anticipate that this is going to change. There's always going to be more good science going on than we can fund. So 2021 is a transitional year. And once we have our research strategy finalized, there will be additional changes to the program. But this is what our research grants are going to look like for this year. Again, it will be an open call as in the past. The topics will be determined by the applicants as in the past. Clearly, they have to be CF related. One thing that will change, and I'll detail this a little bit more in a moment, is on the application, you'll articulate if and how your application aligns to some of those community research priorities that I mentioned earlier. The peer review process is going to change a little bit in that it's only going to be a scientific review. So there won't be the individual with CF or caregiver as part of this panel. Otherwise, the panel will look very similar with the external researchers and the scientific peer review panel. The panel will rank and make a recommendation of which applications are considered fundable and which may not be fundable. Obviously, the ones that are not fundable based on the science won't proceed any further. The applications that are fundable will then go to a second panel that we're developing new for this year, which is the stakeholder review panel. And this will be a group of individuals with CF or their families and caregivers who have a stake in the research that we are funding. And they're largely going to be looking at the lay summary, how the proposals align to the research priorities that have been articulated, and the section where you have an opportunity to describe the value of the proposal, even if it doesn't align very closely to the priorities. And so this is how we're working towards having our research informed a bit more by people living with cystic fibrosis. And of course, this is for the 2021 year, and there will be additional refinements to this as we move forward and finalize our research strategy. So some of the details here, the applications as usual are going to be available on Proposal Central, and those are expected to launch on August 3rd. They're just about ready to go. We're just checking them over, but I expect by once the long weekend is over, those will be launched in the system, and you'll be able to start looking at those applications and completing them. I have listed here that the Grants and Awards Guide is available by August 3rd. Actually, I know it is live on the CF Canada website now, so you can have a look at the new Grants and Awards Guide. So the types of things we're going to be funding, First of all, our clinical fellowships, which is more Ian's area than mine, but we're going to hold this competition at the same time as all of the research competitions as well. So that's why I'm listing it here. Then we have our basic science research grants and clinical research grants, which are essentially the same, other than the focus being either on basic science or more clinically applicable science. Our early career investigator awards, which again are very similar, the major difference being that it's a separate stream for earlier career researchers. And finally, our research fellowship awards as well. So the basic research grants and the clinical research grants are going to have this notice of intent to apply, or LOI, as it's called on Proposal Central. And the deadline for the LOI for these will be September 15th. And then in a very quick turnaround, I'm going to try and have all of the responses out to you by September 20th. Essentially, I'm going to be looking at, are you eligible for the award according to the criteria in the awards guide? Is the research CF, and is it hypothesis driven? And so I anticipate that by far the majority of people will move on from the LOI stage. It's like a tool to help us in knowing what types of applications are coming so that we can start putting together the review panels for the awards. Obviously, the clinical fellowships and the research fellowships don't have an LOI, and as in past competitions, we're not requiring the earlier career investigators to submit an LOI either. So then whether you move on to the full application in the grants or for any of the fellowships or the early career investigator awards, the final deadline for all is November 1st. And that's a little bit later than normal, but we're launching our competition a bit later than normal. However, we're still going to try to provide the notification by the same deadline that we normally use. So the review process after November 1st is going to be very tight. And so there definitely won't be any extensions to the deadlines past November 1st. If you can't submit by November 1st, then you can't submit. So I'm just going to briefly mention some details for each of the awards. So the clinical fellowships, as I mentioned, are more Ian's area, and certainly you can reach out to Ian if you have any particular questions about this, but this is about building capacity in CF care. So the eligibility is that you need to be a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident with an MD degree. You should have completed your clinical training. And the value is $75,000, and this award is for 1 year. And essentially the process really hasn't changed from previous years if you're familiar with the previous application, but certainly reach out to Ian if you would like more information here. And then I'm next moving to the research fellowships, and this is about building capacity in CF research. So we want to bring in and keep younger researchers, new researchers in the CF field. So in order to be eligible, you need to either hold a PhD or an MD degree. You're not required to be a Canadian citizen or permanent resident. You can hold the award at a Canadian institution, even if you aren't. So in rare exceptional circumstances, we'll consider study abroad for Canadian applicants through this, but has to be well justified. And I'd recommend you reach out to me in advance if you're interested in this. And you should be less than 4 years into your post-degree training. Certainly we'll make exceptions for parental leave or other medical leave and different issues. And if you're in this boat, I definitely recommend you reach out to me before applying so that we can make sure everything's in order and ensure that your application is evaluated appropriately. So the last time this competition was held, the value was $35,000 a year, but we've increased it to $40,000 a year. and for up to 2 years for an initial award, and then you can submit a renewal for a 1 more year to a maximum of 3 years support for the research fellowships. And right now there's no special travel allowances because people really still aren't traveling, but this is likely to come back in future years. We're encouraging any of our fellowship winners to apply to other fellowship opportunities, Banting or Tri-Council fellowship awards as well. And I've detailed it now in the guide, but we will be topping up to a reasonable extent other awards, such as if an individual gets a CIHR fellowship. However, I believe Banting is already at $70,000 a year, so we won't be topping up a large award like that. But otherwise, the details of the process are largely unchanged from previous years, and certainly you can reach out to me if you have questions or would like more information. So the basic and clinical research grants, as I mentioned, the LOI deadline is September 15th, with the full application being due on November 1st. We've again set the maximum budget at $100,000 a year, and we're not paying institutional overhead. And these can be for a 1 to 3 year term that you can apply for. And eligibility is pretty much as you would anticipate. This is for independent researchers holding a full-time academic or research appointment at a Canadian university, hospital, or research institute. We may make very rare exceptions to this, but they have to be approved before applying. So certainly reach out to me if you think you're in a position where you should qualify for this, but some of these things maybe don't exactly apply to you, so that we can discuss it before you put together an application. We fund the PI for the grants at a Canadian institution, so we won't fund to a foreign institution. However, we might consider funding collaborators to the PI who are outside of Canada if the funds are flowing from the PI's Canadian institution to that other individual. Again, I would recommend that you reach out to me before you apply. And again, of course, it's hypothesis-driven basic or clinical research with a strong and clear relevance to cystic fibrosis. And I probably don't need to go through this, but you know, examples of basic research would be molecular, cellular based studies or animal studies. It can involve minimal participant involvement, such as blood collection and nasal brushing, these sorts of things for in vitro studies in the lab. But obviously interventional or observational studies are going to be in the clinical research stream. And the committee will look at this, and if your application's not placed in the right stream, then they may adjust which stream it's in. But largely the details of the applications are the same, regardless of which stream you're actually in. And again, we'll be accepting initial or renewal applications. And largely the application process is unchanged from previous years, but I wanted to point out here where there are some minor changes from the previous year. So I mentioned this CF community stakeholder review that will be done. And the lay abstract is going to be probably the largest piece of information that those individuals are going to use from the application. So it means that the lay abstract has become a very important part of the application. And from what I understand in the past, sometimes the organization has reached out to researchers to say, your lay abstract is not at an appropriate level, and work with them to revise this. I'm not going to do that, partly because there's not going to be a lot of time during the review process. So it's really incumbent upon you to write these at the right level write them appropriately for the individuals who will be involved in the stakeholder review. So these are not scientists. These are people who may have CF, or they may have a family member who has CF. So they may be aware generally of what the disease is, and more of the clinical presentation of the disease, but not, you know, NMR ensemble structures or something like this. So what I'm recommending people do is have at least 3 lay people in their life read their lay summary and ask the person to repeat back to them, what is the proposal about, and why is it important to CF patients? Because it would be really a shame to have some applications that are really good, strong science that don't get funded simply because the stakeholder panel members didn't understand what the proposal was about. So I don't think I can stress enough that this lay abstract is going to be really important. In the past, we asked people to indicate what the key words are related to their proposal, and we're going to do that again, and those keywords haven't changed. But in addition to that, another thing that we're going to ask you to do is to choose up to 3 applicable community priorities. And so it's those same priorities that I mentioned before, and I wanted to point out that 1 is enough. You don't need to choose 3. And then the second large change is that you'll have 1,500 characters, or about 250 words, to describe how your proposed research aligns to the priority you selected, or is of relevance to CF in Canada, or should be funded, even if it doesn't align to these priorities. And I think if you try to squeeze, you know, 3 of these priorities that sort of relate to your proposal rather than focusing on one really strong one, then you'll end up using up most of this space to try and justify your choice, rather than using this space to really give a strong case that your proposal should be funded. So while I say you can choose up to 3, if 3 are really appropriate, 1 is certainly enough, and probably the best way to go. So again, I've indicated these priorities that I discussed earlier, but on this list, I've also added 2 more that will be available for you to select. 1 is other, if your proposal really doesn't align to these things, but is something of you know, real value that should be funded, you can choose other and then provide a justification of why this is good science and has applicability to CF patients and it should be funded. And that's fine. If your area is other, that's fine. And then also this relevance to the CF Canadian community. And I put that in there because I think it's important that we fund research that is relevant to Canadian patients. But what I wanted to caution here is I don't want everybody to choose this category simply because they're in Canada and they're Canadian researchers. So choose this category if it's something fundamentally Canadian that you're doing that has high applicability specifically to Canada. So if you were, for example, say, proposing to use CF registry data to look at how individuals in northern remote areas are impacted in their particular outcomes because of the remote area that they live in, then this would be really of relevance to Canada, and it would be something that I would choose this priority on. If you were, say, doing a study to see how the components of lipid rafts impact delta 508 protein function, while yes, lots of people in Canada have delta 508, it's not something that's truly a uniquely Canadian relevance. So I think if in your proposal you you substituted the word Canadian for American or UK or Italy, and it was the same relevance, then don't choose this category. Use this category for something that is uniquely Canadian, research questions that you're trying to address. So I hope that that's clear. I'll move on briefly just to mention the Early Career Investigator Award. So as I mentioned, essentially the application is the same as for the basic and clinical research grants, other than not requiring the LOI. The information that's in the LOI falls into the full application for the early career investigators. So the purpose here is to develop outstanding CF research programs and build a team through operating support grant without having to compete with established investigators. Essentially, we're trying to give a hand to early career investigators so they don't have to compete directly with the established researchers. Again, no LOI, but the full application deadline is November 1st, and the budget is the same, up to $100,000 a year, no institutional overhead offered. But the term is only 1 to 2 years, and these awards are not renewable. So after an early career investigator award, if the researcher wanted to apply for more funding, they would move into the regular stream. So the individuals who are eligible for this, again, are independent researchers, but in this case, who have not held a CF Canada grant previously. Certainly a fellowship is fine, but not one of our research grants. And they should be in their first full-time academic or research appointment. And typically this has been up to 60 months at the time of applying, which is sort of the standard that other organizations in the Tri-Council regulations are. But we're aware that we haven't offered any of these awards in the past 2 years. So at least for this year, we've increased from 60 months to 84 months, an additional 2 years, to make this more fair for individuals who couldn't apply in the last 2 years. And otherwise, the requirements are essentially the same as for the research grants, and the application details are pretty similar. Individuals applying to the Early Career Investigator Awards will also have to complete these same categories that I mentioned previously, the up to 3 research priorities, but probably just your strongest one again. And then describing in 1,500 characters how they align to the priorities, the relevance to Canada, or should be otherwise funded, even if they don't quite align. And again, the lay abstract is going to be really critical for the Early Career Investigator Awards, just as I mentioned for the other awards. And that was all I had. So we've got a little bit of time if people have particular questions. Sorry, I missed that. I didn't notice that there was a message here to me. So what I'm going to do is I've recorded the meeting, and I'm going to format this into a video that's going to be available on the CF Canada website as soon as we can get it uploaded. So the video will have my audio as well as the slides, so that you can refer to those, and certainly feel free to reach out to me as well. Again, my email address is here. But if anybody has any particular questions about the awards in general, how we've made some modifications to the review process, or those additional couple of questions on the proposal, I'm certainly happy to answer any questions you may have. Anna, I see here your hand is up.
Hi there. Thank you so much for that, Sammy. That was very helpful. I was wondering regarding the Early Career Investigator Award, because I guess I haven't looked at past documents in previous years, but does this usually consist of one project, or is it usually as certain early career investigators may try to do, to kind of build something sustainable in their center for future research projects. Could you describe a bit more what it may entail?
So typically this would be one research project that would last 1 to 2 years. However, if it develops into a longer term project, if you receive funding for this early career investigator award, in future years, you can apply to us through the regular stream and build upon that research that you've conducted in the early career investigator award. But it would typically be a single project with a research hypothesis focus, with a budget up to $100,000 for 1 year, or it could be $100,000 a year for 2 years.
Thank you.
Does that help?
Yeah, that's very helpful.
Okay, great. Felix, you had a hand up?
Yes, just there's a question. So as from the experience of the past panel, sometimes for the stakeholders to have somebody to run by some information about the content, which is not necessarily in the grant. So as some expert has been quite helpful in terms of understanding the concept of the grants. Is that planned as part of the stakeholder panel, that they have some go-to representation of somebody with more scientific background to help them in their process? I just thought it might potentially be useful in terms of course, it shouldn't be anybody involved in those grants that are being reviewed, but just to ensure that on the ability to better understand some of these grants might be there.
No, that's a great point. And so far, that person is me, although I'm not sure that that I should be the only person fulfilling that role. So that's something that we still need to think about a little bit. But at minimum, I will be there to help with some of those details that are a little bit complex and difficult to understand. But no, you make an absolutely great point. Thanks.
Okay, no, that's fine. You can probably represent that.
and certainly my role is not going to be to direct where the funding goes to. So, but to assist in understanding some difficult concepts. Yeah. And Juan, I see your hand up as well. How are you?
Well, thank you so much. I was thinking the same lines of Felix just now. When I was in the committee, I found very useful to have stakeholders there in a discussion. I thought it was very helpful to focus and they will bring things. So I was thinking, is there a reason why you're separating these two committees? So it wouldn't make sense to have the scientific officer in the stakeholder committee, the scientific officer from the science committee into the other committee just as an observer to give advice or say, well, this grant had these issues, and vice versa? Wouldn't it be useful to have a stakeholder in the scientific committee? And that's one question. The second question I have is, do you know with the funding level that you have planned, do you know how many grants you may be able to fund in this first competition?
Okay, so I'll start with your first question. Yeah, so probably the scientific officer might be a good choice to have there, depending on availability. And so that would be my preference for a person to help support the community panel. The reason for separating out the community stakeholder panel from the scientific panel is that we want to have more individuals from the community involved, and I think it would make it too many people and too difficult if all of those individuals were in the main scientific panel. But I certainly agree with you. It's always good for the scientists to hear what the CF patients themselves are thinking. So we're going to try it this way for this year, and then definitely get some feedback from both panels about what was good and what wasn't good. And this is only a transition year, and this is not the final setup that we'll necessarily be going with over time, but that's really helpful feedback. And your second question, I knew I was going to get this question, and unfortunately, at this point, I don't know how many we're going to fund, but it's not just going to be one. So, you know, we're not holding a whole competition to just fund one award. What I will say is, sometimes in the recent past, we've been funding more research than we've been raising funds to fund, and using up some of the reserves of the organization. That's not going to happen this year. We certainly have, I would say, less of those reserves to give out. We're still working on the budgeting process, and it's, as you can imagine, it's been a pretty challenging time. And of course, we did stop funding research for a period of time due to the pandemic and the financial difficulties that we were in. But we're confident enough that we're going to have a sufficient budget to run a proper competition this time. So I can't make any promises on numbers, but it's not just going to be one application or two applications. I'm confident that we're going to be able to fund a decent number of applications as we move forward. And I'm sorry I can't give you a more concrete answer.
Thank you very much. Well, by the way, I think that the new system, the new committees, I think is brilliant. I really like what you're doing. So it wasn't a criticism, it was an observation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for your comments. I appreciate that, Ian. Juan, sorry. And are there any other questions that anybody else has? We've still got a couple of minutes if you do. Ian, was there anything that you wanted to bring up about the clinical fellowships that I didn't?
No, thanks very much, Paul. The clinical fellowship program, that's been one of our biggest successes over the past many years, and it's we were able to run it last year. We do award, I can't remember if your slide indicated, but we award up to 2 each year, and the deadline has changed, as you had indicated. I think anyone who is familiar with that program will notice there are not any changes to it, but thanks though.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, I don't see any other hands, but please reach out to me if you have any questions about eligibility, anything that's stated in the Grants and Awards Guide. As I mentioned, it is actually on our website now. If you go to the section about research funding opportunities, Proposal Central is expected to open on August 3rd. And we're on track to do so. If you have questions about your specific situation and in which award is appropriate, or if you have gaps in your research career that you have concerns about, or are uncertain about, you know, international researchers who you'd like to have involved in your application, or any of the eligibility requirements surrounding the fellowships, or any other of these issues, please just reach out to me. I'm happy to hear from you, and we can work through those issues together before you apply. And finally, if you know of any good CF researchers who should be applying to our grants program and didn't get this notice, please direct them to the video that should go up on the CF Canada website within the next day or two, or have them reach out to me as well. I tried to email as many people as I could, but there's always new researchers coming online, And so please share as widely as you can. And thank you for doing that. And thank you for joining me today. It was good to see some faces. And I'm hoping that we can put more effort into reaching out to the basic research community in particular, because I know there's more communication with the clinicians and the clinic directors, certainly, but we don't have as much two-way communication with the basic CF research community. And so I'm looking at ways where we can improve that as well. And if you have suggestions for that, certainly reach out to me as well. So I'd be happy to hear that. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.